Hey guys, my name is Max. I'm here at my company Lansdowne Motorsport, and today I'm going to show you how to rebuild a Ford steering column found in 1992 up to 2007 models. Alright guys, let's get right into this. For tools, you're going to need a 3/8 or 1/4 inch ratchet, a 3/8 or 1/4 inch impact driver, a T30 Torx, a pair of snap ring pliers, a magnet, a flathead screwdriver, a punch, a piece of 3/4 inch PVC, a 3/8 by 16 all thread, and a nut for the thread. For parts, you'll need 2 small bearings, 1 large bearing, and 2 shifter bushings. I'll leave part numbers in the description. It's possible that you'll need more than what I'm using. Be sure to inspect all of your parts after removal and replace anything with irregular wear. First step, remove the shift boot by prying it off of the steering column. Next, we're going to knock out the shift lever pin with a punch. Now remove the T30 Torx bolts holding in the shift tube clamps and solenoid bracket. Remove the shift tube and clamps. We'll come to the back side of the column and remove the clamping spring for the rear bearing by prying it off. Pull off the bearing race and holding ring once the spring is removed. Now remove the 3 Torx bolts holding in the rear bearing retainer and bracket. Pry off the turn signal canceling cam. Using a pair of C-clip pliers, remove the front clip holding in the spring. Pull off the spring and the spring base. Now remove the front bearing race by prying at it with a flathead screwdriver. This may prove to be a little difficult, but continue prying until it slides off. This part commonly needs to be replaced on steering columns with bearing failure. Remove the 2 T30 Torx bolts holding in the ignition switch. Now we'll remove the ignition gear. Start by prying out the hold down clip with a small pick. Once the hold down clip is removed, take a flathead screwdriver and turn the ignition bearing to the right. Remove it with a small magnet. Once this is out, remove the ignition gear with a small magnet as well. Let's split the steering column in half. We'll remove the 2 T30 bolts on each side of the steering column. Once the 2 bolts are out, pry the front housing over the tilt teeth. Be sure not to lose the tilt spring in the process. It may fly out. To disassemble the shift tube, we'll start by removing the 2 T30 bolts from the rear bracket. Remove the spring underneath of the bracket. There's a pin located right by the rear bracket. Use a punch to knock this out and remove the shift lever. The shaft will now easily be removable from the shift tube, and your shift tube is completely disassembled. Be sure to remove and throw away your old shifter bushings. This is a common failure point on these columns and often lead to complete shift tube failure. Now the steering column is fully disassembled. Let's remove the bearings from the front housing. Take a punch and knock them out. You'll likely damage the front bearing, but this should not matter because it will be replaced if you're digging this far into your column. Now that the steering column is fully disassembled, we'll clean and fully inspect each individual piece. I like to spray them down with WD-40 to cut through the grease and dirt that builds up. Be sure to use 4O steel wool to polish parts like the shift clamps, front bearing race, main steering shaft, and shift tube. Be sure to remove all old lubricant as well. Be sure to re-grease your column back to the correct specifications. All of the parts are now cleaned and inspected. We're ready to put the steering column back together. Let's get to it. We'll begin by installing 2 new bearings, 1 small bearing on the front housing and 1 large bearing on the rear of the housing. I like to add a little white lithium grease to the bearings as they sometimes are a little dry from the factory. Line up the small bearing with the housing, making sure that the side with only metal visible is facing you. You don't want to see the side with the rubber ring. Bang the bearing in using a socket. Do the same with the rear side of the housing with a large bearing. Again, you want to be looking at the metal side when it's installed. Now that the bearings are installed, add a small amount of grease to the front of the shaft. Place the shaft through the front housing. Insert the front bearing race by pushing it on with your hands. Slide the spring holder over the bearing race, then slide the spring over top of that. Line up the front clip, then open it up with a pair of C-clip pliers and push it down about an inch. Place your PVC pipe over the front of the shaft. Twist your all-thread into where the steering wheel bolt mounts. Twist the nut onto a few washers tightly by hand, then tighten the whole assembly down with a wrench until you hear a pronounced clicking sound. You'll know the job was done properly when the shaft spins smoothly in the front housing. Now we'll attach the front housing to the main body of the column. Using a vise will help greatly here. Clamp the side of the body onto the vise. Line up the upper housing, making sure the ignition rod goes through the housing. Thread the T30 bolts into each side a turn or two. Place the tilt spring in place. Push the housing down while holding the tilt teeth out of the way. Press down hard and evenly, then bolt in the T30 on the side without the spring. The assembly should be in line now and you'll be able to bolt in the other T30. This step may take a few tries and cause some frustration, but keep pressing in different spots until you're able to lock it in. Be sure that the bolts holding the housing together are very tight. We missed this on video, but you'll need to install the rear bracket and line up the rear bearing over it. Then install the 3 long T30 Torx bolts to hold them in place. Now press the rear bearing race on by hand. Place the spring base over top of it and push the holding spring over top of everything by sliding it on the rear of the shaft. To reassemble the shift tube, you'll start by sliding in the shaft. Make sure that the shaft lines up properly so you can install the lever. Place the lever through the tube and hit the pin through with a hammer. Place the shift spring over the back of the shaft. Bolt down the rear bracket for the shift tube. Be sure these bolts are very tight as they often come loose. Don't forget to install your new shifter bushings, which just slide right onto the tube. We'll install the shift tube by bolting in the 2 clamps with 4 T30 bolts. Loosely tighten them at first. Install the shift solenoid on the back of the column with 3 T30 bolts. Once all bolts are loosely in place, tighten them with a ratchet. Be sure not to over-tighten the bolts as they easily strip out. Now we'll install the ignition and set it at the correct position. You'll notice the ignition gear has a rectangular cutout on it. The side with the additional section on the end should be facing the opposite section of the lock cylinder removal hole. Be sure that your ignition is set in the on position, which can be checked at the underside of the column. It's indicated by a small marking that lines up with the actuator rod cutout. Check that the ignition is in the correct position by turning the gear with a Phillips head screwdriver. Install the ignition bearing so it is facing downward and twist it around until it lines up with the gear. Press the hold down clip into place, then reinstall your lock cylinder. Line up your ignition switch and bolt it down with 2 T30 bolts. Install the turn signal canceling cam on the front of the steering column by pressing it on by hand. Be sure to test all functions. Spin the shaft and listen to see if there are any pronounced grinding noises. Turn the ignition to all positions and be sure that it locks the shaft and shifter in the off position. Reinstall the shift tube pin and shift the column, making sure it smoothly goes into all gears. Pull your tilt lever and make sure the column tilts. However, I've never seen one of these columns with tilt issues. Your steering column is now fully rebuilt and good as new. I hope this video helped. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you quickly. Be sure to check out my company, Lansdowne Motorsport, on eBay. I'll provide a link in the description. If you're not feeling up to the task, we sell most variations of this column fully rebuilt and provide a rebuilding exchange service as well. Thanks for watching, and remember to always wash your hands after touching your shaft.